The countdown display on Ambassador Torrin Ashby's wrist reader had exactly 6 minutes and 40 seconds left on it, and he had no intention of looking at it again until it hit 0. He kept his hands flat on the polished obsidian table of the Hall of Concordance, the way he'd been taught to sit 11 years ago during his first week of diplomatic training, spine straight, palms down, breathing slow enough that the room's atmospheric sensors wouldn't flag a stress spike. Around him, 46 other delegations sat in tiered seating that spiraled upward toward a domed ceiling etched with the sigils of every species that had ever mattered to the Galactic Council. Human seals were absent from that ceiling. They always had been. Speaker Avrin stood at the head of the chamber, 4 arms folded in the layered configuration that Dracian elders used when they wanted everyone to understand a decision had already been made, and this part was simply theater. His translator node hummed against his throat ridge, converting his native clicks into flat, over-articulated standard. "The Council has reached its resolution regarding the Terran Accord," Avrin said, and something in the room settled, the particular stillness of an audience that already knew the ending and was only waiting to see how the losing side would take it. Ashby didn't move. "Effective in 14 standard cycles," Avrin continued, "Earth's outer colonial holdings designated Kepler Reach, the Wolf 359 stations, and all associated mining operations will be transferred to Council administration. A compliance observer fleet will be stationed at Sol's perimeter to ensure the transition proceeds without incident." He paused, 4 eyes sweeping the tiers as though inviting appreciation for his own generosity. "Human vessels above Class 3 designation will be surrendered for decommissioning. This is, I think you will find, considerably more lenient than several delegations proposed." A Cathari representative 3 tiers up made a low clicking sound that might have been a laugh. Ashby didn't look at him. He'd learned a long time ago that looking at the ones who laughed only fed them. "Noncompliance," Avrin added, and here his tone dropped into something almost gentle, the tone of a man delivering bad news to a child he didn't particularly like, "will be interpreted as a hostile act against Council sovereignty. I trust Earth understands what that designation has historically meant for other species." Ashby understood. Everyone in the room understood. It was why the Velmiri delegate 2 seats to his left kept her eyes fixed on the table's grain pattern and hadn't spoken in 40 minutes. "Ambassador Ashby." Avrin said his name the way he always did, with the faint mispronunciation that had become something of a running joke among the older delegations. The SH sound stretched too long, turning Ashby into something closer to Ashby. Someone in the solvent section actually snorted. "The Council awaits Earth's response." Ashby lifted his eyes from the table. He looked at Avrin first, then let his gaze travel, slow and unhurried, across the tiered rows, the Cathari with their claws still tapping in amusement, the Dread-Eye delegation exchanging glances, the small hunched shape of the Velmiri woman who still hadn't looked up. He was not cataloging threats. He had done that math a long time ago, and it had come out the same every time. He was simply looking, the way a man looks at a room he doesn't expect to see again in quite the same way. Then he checked his wrist reader. 6 minutes 4 seconds. "Earth," Ashby said, in the same even, unremarkable voice he'd used for 11 years of trade disputes and border incidents, and the occasional accidental insult delivered in badly translated Dread-Eye, "will require the standard 30-day comment period to review the terms in full, per Council Procedural Statute 41, subsection C." There was a silence of the specific kind that happens when a room expects a scream and receives a memo instead. Avrin's 4 eyes blinked, not quite in unison, which was the closest Dracian physiology came to visible confusion. "The comment period." "Subsection C," Ashby said again, pleasantly. "I believe it's been invoked 11 times in Council history, mostly by species objecting to tariff restructuring. It's rarely used for territorial matters, I'll grant you, but the statute doesn't specify a minimum severity threshold. He folded his hands. We'd simply like our 30 days. Somewhere behind him, the Cathari representative made a sound that had been amusement a moment ago and was now something closer to uncertainty. Avren's translator node hummed, a half-second too long, the auditory equivalent of a man trying to remember how to close his mouth. Ambassador, Avren said slowly, this is a 14-cycle enforcement window. The Council does not typically entertain procedural delay on matters of this. Then perhaps the Council should have specified that in the resolution, Ashby said, not sharp, not triumphant, just factual the way he might point out a typo in a shipping manifest. I've read it twice. It doesn't. Avren's 4 arms unfolded from their layered configuration, which Ashby happened to know, from 11 years of watching this particular species negotiate, was what Dracian elders did when they were buying time to consult a subordinate they didn't want the room to see them consulting. A junior aide 2 steps behind the speaker's dais leaned forward and murmured something in rapid Dracian click speech. Avren's throat ridge-pulsed. The translator caught up half a second late. The Council, Avren said, with the strained patience of a man reading from a script he suddenly wished he'd read more carefully, will take Earth's procedural request under advisement. Appreciated, Ashby said. He did not smile. Smiling would have been a mistake. Smiling implied he found something funny, and the moment anyone in that chamber suspected he found something funny, they would start looking for what it was. Instead, he simply looked for exactly as long as courtesy required, like a man who had won a mildly tedious argument about paperwork and intended to go find lunch. 5 minutes, 11 seconds. The Cathari representative leaned toward his neighbor and said something Ashby's own translator picked up only in fragments, something about human bureaucracy being the last defense of a species with no teeth. A few nearby delegates made sounds that might have been laughter in 6 different vocal registers. Ashby let it happen. He'd built a career letting things happen. What none of them knew, what none of the 46 other delegations packed into that obsidian chamber had any reason to suspect, was that the phrase Ashby had just spoken, 30-day comment period, per Procedural Statute 41, subsection C, was not actually about Procedural Statute 41. It had been chosen 4 months ago, in a windowless room outside Geneva, specifically because it was the kind of sentence a bored diplomat might say on an ordinary Tuesday. Nobody flags a man quoting shipping regulations. Nobody's threat assessment algorithms light up over subsection C. It had been selected the way you select a knock at a door, not for what it means to the person outside, but for what it triggers on the other side, in a room the person outside will never see. 4 months ago, a woman named Dr. Naomi Faraday had stood in that same windowless room outside Geneva and told a table of unsmiling generals that the phrase needed to be something Ashby could say without changing his heart rate. If he has to remember it's a trigger, she'd said, he'll perform normal instead of being normal, and they've had 11 years to learn what his normal looks like. So they'd built the code into something true. Statute 41, subsection C, was real. It existed. It had been invoked 11 times, mostly over tariffs. That was, Ashby privately thought, the best kind of lie, the kind built entirely out of facts, arranged to mean something only if you already knew what you were listening for. 4 minutes, 40 seconds. Avren had recovered his composure mostly, and was already moving on, his aide whispering something about scheduling the compliance fleet's departure regardless of the procedural formality. Because, and Ashby could see this thought arrive on the speaker's face in real time, why would a species with no capital ships worth mentioning need 30 days to accept the inevitable? It was, Ashby thought, a remarkably human oversight for an alien to make, assuming that the absence of visible strength meant the absence of any strength at all. He let his eyes drift one more time toward the Velmiri delegate. She still hadn't looked up from the table, but her hands small, gray. permanently curled from some old injury nobody in that chamber had ever bothered to ask about, had gone very still, in a way they hadn't been a moment ago. As if she, too, were listening for something underneath the words. Ashby didn't know her name. He would, eventually. Everyone would. 3 minutes 2 seconds. Avren was saying something now about the observer fleet's projected timeline, words rolling out in that flattened, over-articulated standard, and Ashby nodded in the places where nodding was expected, the way he'd nodded through 1,000 meetings that meant nothing and this one meeting that meant everything. And underneath the nodding, in the small dark room in the back of his mind where he kept the things he didn't let his face know about, he was counting. Not out loud, not visibly, just a low, patient rhythm, the kind of counting a man does when he has already done the arithmetic 100 times and is only confirming again that the numbers still add up the way they did the last time he checked. 3 going on 2. Somewhere above the chamber's transparent outer hull, in the vacuum on the far side of 6 inches of reinforced viewport glass, a piece of cargo that had been logged 11 weeks ago as a ceremonial gift from the Terran delegation. A decorative housing unit, biometrically inert, cleared by station security in the first 90 seconds of a routine scan, because nobody scans a gift twice, sat exactly where a very tired, very dry-humored engineer named Idris Aquiosa had left it. Deep inside a maintenance corridor, 2 decks below the reactor core. It had been sitting there patient for 11 weeks. It had been sitting there, in one form or another, for considerably longer than that. Avren was still talking. The Cathari representative was still amused. The clock in Ashby's periphery, the one only he could see, the one built into a wrist reader that any council scan would identify as a perfectly ordinary human timepiece, ticked down past the 2-minute mark. And Ambassador Torrin Ashby folded his hands a little more comfortably on the table and did not smile and waited. If you've made it this far, you already know the council's clock ran out faster than theirs did. Drop a comment on what you think woke up 2 decks below the reactor core, and follow along for the next chapter. Asterisk 3 weeks earlier, in the cold black nothing past Neptune's orbit, Dr. Naomi Faraday stood in an airlock that smelled faintly of ozone and old metal and told herself, for the 4th time in 10 minutes, that the shaking in her hands was from the cold. It wasn't from the cold. The suit's internal heating was working fine. She knew that. She checked the readout anyway. Behind her, through the reinforced viewport, the derelict hung against the starfield like something that had been built by someone who'd never once considered symmetry a virtue. It wasn't ship-shaped, not the way the Council's vessels were ship-shaped, all smooth hulls and diplomatic curves designed to look non-threatening on a first-contact scan. This thing was angles. Wrong angles, angles that made the eye want to look away and then, perversely, look back. 41 meters of matte black hull, no visible propulsion, no visible weapons, no markings of any kind. Not even the small ceremonial glyphs every council-registered species stamped somewhere on their hulls, the way humans used to paint names on the noses of old aircraft. It had been drifting in a decaying orbit around Neptune for, the survey team's best estimate, somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years. A deep space telescope array had flagged it 11 months ago as an anomalous mass reading. Nobody had rushed to investigate. There'd been 3 committee meetings about jurisdiction, 2 arguments about whether it fell under a defense budget or a research budget, and 1 memorable incident where a junior analyst had suggested looping in the Council's Xenoarchaeology division, an idea that had been killed so fast and so quietly that the analyst in question still didn't fully understand why everyone in the room had looked at him like he'd suggested inviting a burglar to appraise the silverware. "You're stalling," said a voice in her ear, dry as a decommissioned filing cabinet. "I'm acclimating," Faraday said. "You've been acclimating for 6 minutes. The airlock cycle only takes 40 seconds. I checked." "Of course you checked." Chief Engineer Idris Aquiosa's voice had the particular flatness of a man who had spent 20 years fixing things that weren't supposed to break and had long since run out of patience for ceremony. He was somewhere behind her in the shuttle, running diagnostics on equipment that didn't need diagnostics mostly, she suspected, because it gave him something to do with his hands that wasn't thinking about the shape of the thing outside the window. "You know," he said, "back home, when something looks like that, we generally have a word for it." "What word?" "No." Faraday almost laughed. It came out as something closer to a cough. "Noted, cycling the lock." The interior of the derelict, once they were inside it, was worse in the specific way that empty places are always worse than occupied ones. No debris. No bodies, which should have been a relief and somehow wasn't. No visible damage of the kind that suggested a battle, an accident, a struggle of any kind. Just corridors, if corridors was even the right word for spaces built at angles no human joint bent comfortably to navigate, stretching away into a darkness, their suit lights swallowed without illuminating. "It's clean," said Priya Anand, the team's structural engineer, her voice tight over the comm. "Too clean, like somebody parked it and walked away." "Or somebody parked it and it walked away from them," Aquiosa said. "That's not better, Idris." "I didn't say it was better, I said it was an option." They found the core chamber 6 hours in, at the end of a corridor that curved in a way that made Faraday's inner ear file a formal complaint. The chamber itself was circular, domed, and at its center sat a structure roughly the size of a delivery van, dark, seamless, humming, not audibly, not through the suit's external mics, but through the soles of her boots, a vibration so low it felt less like sound and more like the memory of sound. Nobody wanted to go first. Faraday noticed this happening in real time, the way the team's formation subtly rearranged itself around the chamber's threshold. 4 trained professionals suddenly finding urgent reasons to check equipment that didn't need checking, recalibrate readings that didn't need recalibrating. It was Aquiosa in the end, who stepped through, muttering something about how somebody had to be the one filling out the incident report either way. Might as well be him. He had good handwriting. The device didn't attack them. It didn't do anything at all for 3 days except hum and wait. And once Faraday's team rigged a passive scanner to it rather than an active one, because nobody was willing to be the first to actually ping the thing, begin slowly to talk. Not in words, not at first, in patterns, a sequence of pulses that took the ship's onboard linguistae, a battered old system named Meridian that had been repurposed from a weather forecasting program because nobody had budgeted for a dedicated xenolinguistics unit, 4 days to identify as language at all, and another 6 to begin producing anything like a translation. What it produced, when it finally produced something, was not what any of them had expected. Fragments, logs, a voice, or the recorded impression of one, flattened by 10,000 years of data degradation into something closer to a whisper pressed through gravel describing a people. Not a species name. The logs never used one. Just a designation, a string of characters Meridian rendered, for lack of anything better, as Unit 7. They didn't have a name for themselves, Faraday said, sitting in the shuttle's cramped galley on the 4th night, staring at a translated fragment on a cracked tablet screen. Or they did, and it's not in here. Every reference to their own people is just a number, a designation. Like whoever wrote this had learned to think of their own species the way somebody else told them to. Cheerful, Aquiosa said, not looking up from the ration pack he was very slowly not eating. There's more, she scrolled. This isn't a weapon, or it is, but that's not what it was built as. Best guess, Meridian's confidence is low, but it reads like a failsafe, a last resort. Something you build when you already suspect you're not going to survive long enough to need anything less drastic. Survive what? Faraday didn't answer right away. On the tablet, another fragment resolved, Meridian's translation confidence flickering between 40 and 60%. The words assembling themselves the way a jigsaw puzzle assembles itself when half the pieces are missing, and you're filling in the picture from memory rather than evidence. Unification proceeds regardless of consent. 17 colonies non-compliant, council fleet. "Oh," Aquiosa said, in the tone of a man watching a joke arrive at its punchline about 4 seconds before everyone else in the room. "Oh, that's not great. It gets worse. It always does." She turned the tablet toward him. The last coherent fragment, Meridian's confidence rating a full 81%, the highest of anything they'd recovered, sat alone on the cracked screen in flat, ugly, unpoetic translation. "We built this so that someone, eventually, would finish what we could not. We were not permitted the time." Nobody said anything for a while. Somewhere outside the shuttle's thin hull, the derelict continued its slow, patient hum, 10,000 years deep into a wait it hadn't chosen the length of. "You know what the funny thing is," Aquiosa said eventually, setting down his ration pack, "is that somewhere in council archives, there's a very official, very boring historical record that lists this as a natural extinction event. Environmental collapse. Something with a nice clean cause nobody has to feel weird about at dinner parties." "You looked it up." "I looked it up." He rubbed his face. "Took Meridian 9 minutes to cross-reference the designation against council public record. 9 minutes, Naomi, for a genocide. I've spent longer than that arguing about parking." Faraday looked back at the screen, at the flat, ugly sentence sitting there without any punctuation to soften it. "We were not permitted the time." She thought about the word unification, the same word that had shown up verbatim in 11 separate council communiques to Earth over the past decade, always dressed in the language of partnership, of shared prosperity, of a rising tide lifting every species smart enough to climb aboard. "It's not a weapon we built," she said slowly. "It's a debt somebody else is owed. We just found where they buried the receipt." Aquiosa didn't laugh this time. He picked his ration pack back up, looked at it, put it back down again. "So what do we do with a receipt like that?" Faraday didn't answer immediately. Above them, through 6 meters of shuttle hull and the endless black beyond it, the derelict kept humming, kept waiting, the way it had been waiting since before either of their species had learned to build anything that could hear it. "We deliver it," she said finally. "Somewhere it'll get read." 3 days later, a shipping manifest was filed with Council Customs listing 1 crate, contents, ceremonial diplomatic housing unit, decorative, non-functional gift of the Terran delegation on the occasion of the 11th anniversary of first contact. It was scanned once, by a bored Drassian customs officer who had scanned 4,000 identical-looking crates that month, and had long since stopped expecting any of them to be interesting. The crate cleared inspection in 90 seconds. Aquiosa, watching the confirmation come through on a secure feed from a windowless room outside Geneva, allowed himself exactly one small, tired smile. The kind a man allows himself after filling out a very long form correctly on the first try, before he reached for the next set of coordinates, and the next set of forged paperwork, and the long, patient work of making sure that, when the receipt finally got read, it would be read in exactly the right room, at exactly the right time. If a species can bury a genocide behind a customs form, what do you think else the Council's been hiding? Sound off in the comments and stick around, because Chapter 3 is where the gift finally gets delivered. Asterisk, the delivery ceremony had been scheduled, with deliberate and almost insulting blandness, as part of Cultural Exchange Week. A council tradition so tedious that even the delegations required to attend had developed an entire private vocabulary of polite ways to describe how little they wanted to be there. Ashby had sat through 6 of them in 11 years. He'd learned that the surest way to become invisible in a room full of aliens was to look precisely as bored as everyone assumed you already were. Chief Engineer Idris Aquiosa had never attended one before, which was, as far as Ashby was concerned, exactly the problem. "Smile less," Ashby murmured, not moving his lips much, as the two of them walked a converted cargo pallet down the wide, echoing promenade of Nexus Station's cultural wing, trailing behind three actual diplomatic aides who had no idea what they were escorting. "You look like a man who's about to win something." "I am a man who's about to win something." "You look like it, stop looking like it." Aquiosa adjusted his expression into something closer to mild constipation, which Ashby privately decided was, if nothing else, a considerable improvement. The crate itself rode on the pallet wrapped in ceremonial cloth, dyed the pale gold that council protocol designated as an acceptable color for gift-giving between species of unequal standing, a detail some junior aide in Geneva had researched with what Ashby considered unnecessary thoroughness, but which had, in the end, turned out to matter. Council customs officers didn't scan gold-wrapped gifts as carefully. Gold-wrapped gifts implied deference. Deference implied harmlessness. Nobody spent real time inspecting harmless. The customs officer on duty that morning was a Dracian named Vec, mid-level, visibly unenthusiastic about his posting, who ran his scanner over the crate's surface in the specific board arc of a man who had scanned 4,000 crates that fiscal cycle, and intended to scan 4,000 more with the absolute minimum expenditure of attention required to avoid a disciplinary write-up. "Contents?" Vec asked, not looking up. "Ceremonial housing unit," said the lead aide, a young woman named Preeti Malakar who had rehearsed this line 11 times in the shuttle over and had still somehow made it sound like she was reading it off a cue card, which, fortunately, was itself a fairly convincing human trait. Decorative, presented on behalf of the Terran delegation for the 11th anniversary of First Contact. Vec's scanner beeped its low, satisfied confirmation tone, non-explosive, non-biological, structurally inert per standard material classification, all of which was, strictly speaking, true. The device inside gave off no radiation the scanner was calibrated to detect, because whatever had built it 10,000 years before anyone in that customs line had developed the instruments to look for what it actually was. "Fine," Vex said, already reaching for the next crate in line, a Cathari shipment of what appeared to be ceremonial pottery. "Cleared." Aquiosa did not exhale until they were 40 meters down the promenade. Even then, he did it quietly, through his nose, the way a man releases tension he's not willing to admit he was holding. "That's it," he murmured. "That's it," Ashby said. 10,000 years of build-up, and the whole thing clears customs because a bored man in a bad mood wanted his coffee. "I'm going to need several drinks after this. You're going to need to finish installing it first." The maintenance corridor 2 decks below the station's primary reactor core had been selected 4 months earlier, from orbital schematics smuggled out through a trade attaché, with an unusually generous definition of diplomatic courier privileges. It was narrow, poorly lit, serviced twice a cycle by an automated maintenance drone whose patrol schedule council engineering had never once bothered to update in the 11 years since it was installed, because nobody expected anyone to care about a corridor that led nowhere except a reactor housing unit humans weren't cleared to see anyway. Which was, Aquiosa reflected as he crouched in that same corridor 6 hours later, exactly why nobody had thought to guard it. "Talk to me," said a voice in his ear, Faraday, 3 decks up, monitoring telemetry from a service closet she'd requisitioned under the pretense of calibrating cultural exchange audiovisual equipment, a lie so boring that nobody had questioned it for more than 4 seconds. "Housing stable," Aquiosa murmured, running a gloved hand along a seam in the reactor conduit that, to any council engineer, would have looked like standard thermal shielding. "Give me 6 minutes on the coupling." "You have 4. Drone patrols early today." "Drone patrol is never early." "Drone patrol is early today, Idris." Aquiosa didn't waste breath swearing. He'd learned, over 2 decades of fixing things that weren't supposed to break, that swearing cost you roughly 4 seconds you didn't have, and he had exactly none to spare. His hands moved fast, sure, the particular economical speed of a man who had rehearsed this exact motion sequence 41 times in a mock-up built in a Colorado warehouse before ever setting foot on the real station. The coupling clicked home. The relic device, repackaged now, stripped of its ceremonial gold wrapping, disguised beneath a housing plate stamped with a maintenance code that matched 11 other genuine housing plates in that same corridor, settled into place against the reactor's outer shielding with a soft, final sound, like a key finding the lock it was always going to fit. He had 90 seconds to spare when the drone rounded the corner. It was a squat, unremarkable thing, boxy and slow, sweeping a passive scanner arc across the corridor floor and walls in a pattern it had run 11,000 times before without incident. Aquiosa flattened himself into the shadow of a genuine maintenance alcove 8 meters back, breathing shallow, watching the drone's scanner light pass over the housing plate he'd just installed. It didn't slow down. Why would it? The plate matched the pattern. The corridor matched the schedule. Nothing about this moment differed to any sensor calibrated to notice difference from 10,000 identical moments before it. That, Aquiosa thought, watching the drone trundle past and away down the corridor, was the whole trick, wasn't it? Not deception exactly. Just the patient exploitation of somebody else's certainty that nothing here was worth looking at twice. Clear, Faraday said in his ear, exhaling audibly. Told you 4 minutes was plenty. You had 90 seconds, Idris. Plenty, he repeated, already moving back down the corridor, unhurried now. A maintenance technician with a clipboard and a bored expression, exactly the way he'd rehearsed. Back in the cultural wing, Ambassador Ashby was 3 hours into a ceremony that had, by his private estimate, generated absolutely nothing of diplomatic value beyond a mild headache and a renewed appreciation for the phrase per standard protocol. He stood near the edge of the gathered crowd, watching a Solvan delegate deliver a lengthy speech about the historical significance of cultural cross-pollination, and let his eyes drift, briefly, toward a small gray figure standing near the promenade's far wall. The Velmiri delegate, he still didn't know her name, not yet was watching him. Not obviously. Not in any way the room's dozens of translator nodes and observation systems would flag as unusual. Just a glance, held a half-second too long, the kind of look one person gives another when they suspect, without any evidence they could name, that they are both waiting for the same thing. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. Something in her posture shifted anyway, a straightening, almost imperceptible, the kind of small physical change a body makes when it decides, privately, to stop bracing. Later, Ashby would learn her name was Kess, and that she had spent the better part of 2 decades working maintenance contracts on council stations across 17 systems, cleaning corridors and servicing drones and being, in every practical sense, invisible to the people who employed her. He would learn that invisibility had its uses. He would learn, in fact, that it was the second-best kept secret on Nexus Station, after the one currently humming quietly against the reactor's outer shielding 2 decks below. For now, he only knew that she was watching him, and that he did not look away first. The ceremony ended at 1400 hours station time. Ashby walked back to the human delegation's assigned quarters, logged a routine diplomatic report describing the day's events as productive, and set his wrist reader on the small table beside his bunk, where it sat, silent, counting down a number only he had reason to know was counting at all. 11 weeks. That was how long the device would wait, dormant and patient beneath 11 false maintenance plates, humming at a frequency no council sensor had ever been built to notice, while diplomats argued about tariffs and territorial boundaries and the precise wording of an ultimatum they believed, with the specific unearned confidence of people who had never once lost a war they started, would be received exactly the way every previous ultimatum had been received. Ashby had 11 weeks to wait, too. He spent them the way he'd spent the previous 11 years, sitting through meetings, absorbing insults delivered in 6 different translated tongues, filing every one of them somewhere deep and useful, and waiting, with the patience of a species that had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning that the ones who survived were rarely the strongest in the room. They were simply the ones willing to wait exactly as long as it took. The gifts in place, the countdowns running, and next chapter the council finally finds out what 30-day comment period actually meant. Drop a like if you caught the code phrase from chapter 1, and stay tuned for the fallout. Asterisk, the lights in the Hall of Concordance flickered exactly once, a small, almost apologetic stutter, 31 seconds after Ambassador Torrin Ashby folded his hands on the table and said nothing at all. Nobody noticed at first. Speaker Avren was still talking, 4 arms gesturing through the logistics of the Compliance Observer Fleet's deployment schedule, his translator node humming along in its flat, over-articulated standard. And the flicker registered, if it registered at all, as the kind of thing a station's aging power grid did occasionally, the way an old building's radiators knocked in winter. The second flicker, 11 seconds later, lasted almost a full second, and this time several delegates looked up. "Facilities," Avren said, with the mild irritation of a man interrupted mid-sentence by something beneath his notice, "will address the lighting." Facilities did not address the lighting, because Facilities, at that moment, 3 decks below the chamber, was discovering that the reactor's primary monitoring array had stopped reporting anything at all, and that the backup array had begun reporting numbers that made no sense against any baseline in 11 years of operational history, numbers that weren't rising or falling so much as reorganizing. The way a held breath reorganizes into something else entirely in the half-second before it becomes a scream. Ashby did not look at his wrist reader again. He didn't need to. He'd built the habit of not looking into his hands the way other men built the habit of not scratching an itch, and he sat very still and watched Avren's 4 eyes narrow very slightly as a third flicker rolled through the chamber and did not, this time, resolve back into steady light. "Someone find out what that is," Avren said to nobody and everyone, the first faint crack of uncertainty entering a voice that had spent the better part of a century never needing to sound uncertain about anything. 2 decks below, Chief Engineer Idris Aquiosa's device woke up. It did not wake up the way a bomb wakes up, with heat and noise and the blunt finality of an ending. It woke up the way a very old, very patient mind wakes up after 10,000 years of dreamless waiting, slowly, at first, testing the shape of the systems around it the way a hand tests a doorknob before deciding whether to turn it. It found the reactor's control architecture, ancient by council standards but still, to something built by a species that had engineered failsafes meant to outlast their own extinction, laughably simple. It found the life support grid. It found the docking clamps, the internal door seals, the gravity plating, the translator relay network that carried standard into 46 different alien throats and back out again. It found all of it, and it did not ask permission, because nothing about its design had ever included the concept of asking. In the Hall of Concordance, every translator node in the room went silent at once. For the Cathari representative 3 tiers up, still mid-chuckle at some private joke about human procedural delay, the silence arrived as a physical sensation. The small device clipped to his throat ridge simply stopping, mid-syllable, leaving him producing a sound with no translation attached to it. A sound that meant nothing to anyone in the room who didn't speak Cathari natively, which was everyone except the 3 other Cathari delegates seated near him. He stopped laughing. He looked, for the first time in Ashby's 11 years of watching him, genuinely uncertain of what to do with his own face. "Avren," a Drassian aide's voice, sharp now, no longer bothering with the layered vocal configuration that indicated deference to a superior. "Avren, the reactor array it's not responding to command authentication. It's not responding to anything." Override it. I'm trying. It's not the system's not refusing the override. It's not even registering that we're issuing one. Ashby watched Avren's 4 arms drop from their careful diplomatic configuration into something looser, more animal, the posture of a body remembering, very suddenly, that it had instincts older than its titles. Around the chamber, 46 delegations were discovering, each in the private language of their own physiology, what it felt like to realize that the room they were sitting in no longer belonged to them. The internal door seals locked first. Not the Hall of Concordance's doors, not yet, but the ones on the lower decks, the maintenance corridors and cargo bays and crew quarters where Council Station personnel had spent the last several minutes trying, with increasing panic, to reach the reactor core and do something, anything, to reassert control over a system that no longer recognized their authority as relevant to the conversation. Doors that had opened on command 11,000 times that cycle simply stopped opening. Not locked in any sense a locksmith would recognize, reclassified, the way a word gets reclassified when its meaning quietly changes underneath it, so that pressing the release panel produced not an error message but a kind of patient, mechanical silence, the silence of a system that had heard the request and decided calmly that it no longer applied. A Dracian technician named Vel, 26 years old, 6 months into his first real posting, stood in front of one such door for 11 seconds, pressing the release panel with increasing force, before he understood, with the particular clarity that arrives just before panic, that force was not the variable that mattered here. He did not die in that corridor. Ashby would learn later that almost nobody did, that whatever had built the relic device 10,000 years ago had built something with a very specific, very old grievance, and that grievance had never once, in any of the fragments Faraday's team recovered, extended to indiscriminate slaughter. It had extended, with what Ashby would come to think of as an almost bureaucratic precision, to control. To the removal of authority from hands that had held it too long and too carelessly. Vel did not die. Vel simply stood in a sealed corridor for 6 hours, along with everyone else in it, breathing recycled air that the system continued without malice to provide, while somewhere above him an entire governing structure came apart in real time. Back in the Hall of Concordance, the lights failed completely for 4 seconds and came back on dimmer, amber-toned, running on some backup circuit the reactor's new occupant had apparently decided was an acceptable expenditure of resource. "This is an act of war," Avren said, into a room where his translator node no longer worked, so that the words came out in raw Dracian click speech, understood only by the handful of delegates who spoke it natively, which meant that, for the first time in the history of the Council, its presiding speaker delivered a declaration of war that most of the room present could not understand. Ashby understood it. He'd spent 11 years learning Dracian the slow, unglamorous way, sitting through language modules at 3 in the morning because Dr. Yale Oren's original protocol had specified, in a memo he'd read exactly once and never forgotten, that the ambassador should never require another species' charity to know what was being said about him. "No," Ashby said, quietly, in Standard, though there was no translator left to carry it to anyone but the handful nearby who spoke Earth's tongue directly. "It's a repossession." Avren didn't hear him. Avren was staring at his own hands, at the 4 fingers that had gestured through a century of decisions that had never once required this kind of scrutiny. And Ashby watched something happen to the speaker's face that he recognized, distantly, as the particular unraveling of a man discovering that the machinery beneath his authority had never actually belonged to him in the first place. 2 decks below, in the reactor's control substation, a small gray figure moved through a service corridor that the relic's new occupancy of the station's systems had, for reasons only she fully understood, left conspicuously, deliberately unsealed. Kes had spent 19 years cleaning corridors on Council Station, across 17 systems. She had spent most of those 19 years invisible in the specific way that maintenance staff were always invisible to the species who employed them. Present in every room, acknowledged in none, trusted with access codes and patrol schedules, and the small, unglamorous secrets of a station's daily operation, precisely because nobody in power had ever imagined that invisibility might, one day, be weaponized against them. She reached the substation's auxiliary terminal, the one she'd serviced 400 times without incident, and pressed her palm against a reader that had, until 6 minutes ago, required a council administrative clearance she had never once been issued. It let her in. It had been letting people like her in for 11 weeks, quietly, patiently, ever since a dormant intelligence 10,000 years old had begun testing the shape of the station's systems and discovered, buried in its own ancient logs, a designation, a grievance, a pattern of exclusion it recognized because it had been built once by a people who'd suffered exactly this. The device had not needed Earth to find the Velmiri, or the 17 other quietly disaffected maintenance workers scattered across Nexus Station's lower decks. It had found them itself, in the station's own personnel records, cross-referenced against a public archive of labor grievances the Council had never bothered to encrypt because it had never occurred to anyone in power that the grievances of the powerless might one day matter. Kess had known for 6 weeks that something was coming. She had not known until this exact moment, standing in front of a terminal that opened for her hands and no one else's, that she would be the one asked to help finish it. "We built this," she murmured in her own tongue, reading a fragment of translated log scrolling across the terminal screen, words she recognized in her bones before she recognized them in her mind, so that someone, eventually, would finish what we could not. She pressed her palm flat against the console. Somewhere above her, the Hall of Concordance's amber emergency lighting held steady, and Ambassador Torrin Ashby sat very still in a chamber full of the powerful, discovering, for the first time in living memory, what it felt like to not be in control of the room, and did not smile, because there was nothing yet to smile about, only, for the first time in 11 years, the quiet and entirely unfamiliar sensation of watching something finally begin to balance. The Council's grip just broke, and it wasn't Earth alone that broke it. Comment who you think Kess really works for, and don't miss the final chapter, where the dust settles and a very different kind of table gets built. 6 hours after the lights in the Hall of Concordance failed for the last time and came back amber, Ambassador Torrin Ashby walked the length of Nexus Station's central promenade and discovered that grandeur, stripped of its power supply, looked very much like a museum that had forgotten to finish being built. The obsidian walls were still obsidian. The ceiling still bore the carved sigils of 47 species, still caught the dim amber emergency lighting in the same way it had always caught the brighter, more confident light of a functioning reactor. But the promenade's usual current of foot traffic, aides hurrying between briefings, delegates trading rehearsed pleasantries, the low permanent hum of a station that had never once, in its recorded history, gone quiet, had stopped. What remained instead was a scattering of figures standing very still in doorways, or sitting on the floor in postures no protocol manual had ever anticipated, because no protocol manual had ever anticipated a scenario in which the station itself simply declined to recognize anyone's authority at all. He found the surviving remnant of the Council's administrative staff in a side chamber off the main hall, 11 of them, various species, various states of composure, gathered around a data terminal that one particularly stubborn Drassian clerk kept attempting to reboot despite it having produced nothing but the same 3 lines of untranslated status text for the past 4 hours. Ambassador, the clerk looked up. His name, Ashby would eventually learn, was Dressa, and he had worked in Council Records administration for 31 years. And he had the particular haunted focus of a man clinging to procedure, because procedure was the only thing left that still made sense to him. I need to file a formal grievance regarding the unauthorized seizure of station infrastructure. Who do I address it to? Ashby looked at him for a long moment. I don't think there's a department left to receive it. There's always a department. Dressa said this the way a man recites a prayer he stopped believing in but hasn't found the nerve to abandon. I'll need 3 copies, standard format. I'll let you know if I find someone qualified to read them, Ashby said, and did not smile, though something in him distantly wanted to. He found Speaker Avrin 40 minutes later, alone in what had once been his private antechamber off the main hall, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, all 4 arms hanging loose at his sides in a posture Ashby had never once, in 11 years, seen a Drassian elder adopt in front of anyone. Avrin's translator node hung dead against his throat ridge. He didn't look up when Ashby entered. Ashby didn't say anything for a while. There didn't seem to be anything worth saying in a language Avrin could hear, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't particularly want there to be. He'd spent 11 years rehearsing versions of this moment in his head, and in every one of them he'd imagined something with more heat in it, a speech, a reckoning, some line he'd deliver that would land the way Avrin's ultimatums had always landed, casual and devastating and utterly certain of their own authority. Standing here now, he found he had no interest in any of it. There was nothing satisfying about watching a man discover the floor was made of something other than what he'd always assumed. There was only the floor, and the discovering, and the long quiet after. He left without speaking. The Velmiri delegation's quarters were 3 decks down, in a section of the station that had, until 6 hours ago, been kept at a humidity level the Velmiri had complained about for years without effect. Ashby found Kess sitting on the floor of a small maintenance alcove just outside those quarters, not inside them, her back straight in a way he suspected, watching her, was new. "You're not hiding," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I don't need to anymore." Kess didn't look up right away. When she did, her small gray face held an expression Ashby didn't have a word for in any of the 6 languages he spoke, something between exhaustion and disbelief, the particular look of a body that has spent so long braced for impact that it no longer entirely trusts the absence of one. 19 years, she said. I have serviced this station's maintenance systems for 19 years, Ambassador. Do you know how many times in 19 years anyone asked my name? I don't. Neither do I, that's the answer. She flexed her hands slowly, the curled fingers unfolding a fraction further than Ashby had seen them manage before. I am not telling you this so that you will feel sorry. I am telling you because I think you are the only person on this station today who will understand why I did what I did, and it was not for you. I know, Ashby said. You don't. Kess's voice for the first time carried something sharp in it. Your engineers built a very clever device, Ambassador. Your Dr. Faraday found it and your Mr. Aquiosa installed it, and I am certain you are all very pleased with yourselves. But the device did not do this alone. It found us. It found 17 of us on this station, across records nobody in the council ever thought worth encrypting, because nobody in the council ever thought our grievances worth the paper to write them on. It recognized something in us before we recognized it in the device. We were not your instrument. We were the ones the instrument had been waiting for. Ashby absorbed this in silence. He thought of the log fragment Faraday had shown him, weeks ago, in a windowless briefing room outside Geneva. We built this so that someone, eventually, would finish what we could not, and understood, for the first time with any real weight, that the sentence had never once been about Earth. Then I'm glad it found you first, he said. Kess studied him for a long moment, the way a person studies someone deciding whether to trust a stranger's stillness. Then slowly, she pressed both palms flat against the alcove's floor. The same gesture, Ashby would later learn, that Velmiri tradition reserved for the honoring of new ground, a gesture her people had not been permitted to perform anywhere but their own homeworld in longer than most of them could remember. She did not weep. Ashby had half expected her to and was glad in some obscure way that she didn't. She simply knelt there for a moment, palms against the deck plating, checking, he understood without being told, whether the floor beneath her was real. It was 1 year and 3 days after the fall of Nexus Station that Ashby stood in an unfinished building on the outskirts of Geneva and watched a construction crew argue, cheerfully, about load-bearing calculations for a room that did not yet have a name. The building had no towering ceilings, no elevated speakers dais. The architects, several of them Velmieri, working alongside human engineers in a partnership that had required, in the first few months, more patience than either species had expected to need, had designed the central chamber as a circle, weighted so that the smallest delegations sat nearest the center and the largest farthest from it, an arrangement that had generated, predictably, considerable outrage from the larger species currently negotiating entry and something closer to disbelief from the smaller ones. 7 species had formally joined what everyone was provisionally, almost apologetically, calling the Congress of Shared Worlds, a name chosen, after 4 months of argument, mostly because it was the only option boring enough for all 7 delegations to agree on. Kess worked as a construction consultant on that crew now, standing in the unfinished central chamber pointing at something in the support structure, while a human engineer nodded and took notes. Ashby watched her from the window of an office 2 floors up, and found, as he had found several times over the past year, that the sight was difficult to look at for longer than a few seconds, not because it was painful, but because it wasn't, and he had not yet fully adjusted to what that felt like. An aide knocked and entered without waiting for an answer, the way aides in this building had learned to do because formality here was still, gradually, being reinvented from scratch. "The Cathari observer from the breakaway governor's territory arrives tomorrow," she said, "and the Kasatha delegation is asking about the voting weight protocol again. Tell the Kasatha we'll have a revised draft by Thursday." Ashby reached for his jacket. "And make sure the observer suite's humidity is set correctly this time. Nobody tells me until after." "Already handled." "Good." He paused at the door. On the wall beside it hung a photograph nobody had officially commissioned. Someone had simply printed it during the building's first chaotic weeks and pinned it up, and nobody had ever taken it down. It showed Kess, months ago, palms pressed flat against the floor of a human docking bay on the day the Velmieri delegation had first set foot on Earth's soil, weeping without any attempt at composure, while a human dock worker set a water vessel beside her without making eye contact and stepped quietly back. Someone had written beneath the photograph, in several languages, in careless marker. She was checking if it was real. Ashby looked at it for a moment, the way he'd looked at it most mornings for the past year, and then walked out into the corridor, his footsteps quiet on floorboards that were, like the building itself, still only partly finished. He said it to no one, the way a thought says itself when it's been sitting in your chest too long to keep holding without air. "We didn't do this because we were the strongest. We did it because someone finally had to go first." The corridor was empty. There was no one to hear it. That was fine. Below him, a circular room 40% finished was slowly, patiently becoming something that had never existed before, not a hierarchy dressed in the language of cooperation, but something closer, he hoped, to an actual attempt at the thing the Council had only ever pretended to build. There was still a Solvan fleet massed at the border. There were still 3 delegations pretending not to know things everyone knew. There was still always work. Humanity had always been best when it had work. If this ending hit different than you expected, tell me in the comments which twist got you, the countdown, the debt, or Kess, and follow for the next HFY story, because the Congress of Shared Worlds is only 40% built.